Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Christina Fox, the CEO of Tech Alliance, and as the Regional Innovation Center for Southwestern Ontario, Tech Alliance is the place for dreamers, innovators, and world-changing ideas. We're focused on building a globally competitive innovation economy that enables entrepreneurship, spurs accelerated growth, attracts ambitious talent, and new companies. So before we get started, let me share a few key points. Everyone today is muted, and today's masterclass will be recorded and made available following the session. If you'd like to keep up with everything there is to know about Southwestern Ontario's innovation economy, sign up for our weekly newsletter and the link will be dropped in the chat bar. Today, we are certainly delighted to host our masterclass on Design Sprint Fundamentals, bringing together incredible industry experts to show how to transform your idea, new venture, or project with best-in-class techniques. Design sprints completely shift your mindset and allow you to accelerate from zero to prototype in 1 week. It's true, providing critical feedback about whether your ideas for marketing, product design, or customer experiences will actually work. And we're so pleased to be joined by Carlos and Leah Oliveira, founders of AdaptX, a design sprint and innovation consultancy. We will explore a super fast-paced introductory framework of design sprint and how to solve challenges, quickly test solutions, and delight your customers. Carlos is an experienced entrepreneur, facilitator, and innovation coach, specializing in strategic product development and innovation leadership. His expertise applies design thinking, lean startup, and agile practices to help companies make better decisions, build solutions, and innovate at scale. Over his career, Carlos has led and supported significant tech-enabled projects with top brands including Scotiabank, CIBC, Rogers Communications, TELUS, Bell Canada, HP, Microsoft, Canadian Tire, the Government of Canada, Sun Life, and many more. Really impressive. Leah is a change agent and a perennial entrepreneur dedicated to helping organizations create meaningful engagement opportunities, collaborative cultures, and environments that facilitate growth. She is a key proponent of moving organizational change forward and innovation forward through her training sessions and workshops. Welcome, Carlos and Leah. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you to everybody for joining us here today. I'm very excited to talk to you for the next hour about something that we're very passionate about and huge advocates of, which is design sprints. What we're hoping to accomplish by the end of the session is that you'll have a good understanding of what design sprints encompass, what they look like in action, why they're so powerful, and why you should start using them ASAP in your environment. Our contact information is here. I'll share it again at the end. We will have a Q&A at the end. However, if you ever have a question about design sprints, we're always very happy to connect with you and talk about it because we're very passionate about helping organizations bring this into their environments, as mentioned. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. What is a design sprint? Design sprint is a repeatable, structured process that's grounded in design thinking, and the whole purpose of it is to acquire some rapid learning, especially in the face of uncertainty. Because we're focusing on learning and acquiring really critical information early on, design sprints are both an exceptional de-risking tool as well as a phenomenal tool for any innovation toolbox. So, as mentioned, it's grounded in the concepts of design thinking, so it does bear a moment to address design thinking. I'm not going to get too far into it. You can take a full 4-year bachelor's at Stanford, so it really is a very deep framework. But what you need to know today in the context of design sprints is that design thinking is really about a creative, collaborative approach to problem solving that is used to generate very human-centered, customer-centric solutions. So it's really great for innovation because we're focusing on the customer. Here we do say that it's a foundational philosophy, but it's also a very practical and applicable methodology, but the philosophical element to it, having seen it applied in various environments, especially in an enterprise environment, is that once an organization starts to bring it in, it fundamentally changes the way that they think about and work with their stakeholders, their customers, their end users, but it also starts to change the ways in which collaboration occurs within the environment. So it is very philosophical, but again, there is a very practical methodological, if that's even a word, framework that has some very tangible, usable, and repeatable tools. So here's a great example of what that human-centered or customer centricity looks like in the context of design thinking. For those of you who remember the good old glass ketchup bottle that Heinz used to have, it was literally the worst. It was hard to use, it was inconsistent, it was unpredictable. You'd have to like really shake it sometimes to get, or like dig a knife in to get ketchup out, and then other times you'd end up with like an entire plate of ketchup. So not a very user-friendly product design. So when they took a more human-centered or customer-centric approach to the design and reimagining the design, you can see that it completely addressed all of the problems and wants and needs of customers as related to ketchup. So the design is very ergonomic, it's easy to hold, it's easy to use, you control the flow, it's not messy anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So here you really see the convergence of customer value and business value. So much like Heinz, customer centricity really pays off. So this is S&P 500 from 2 years ago. I'm sure it'd even be a bigger divide now. But you can see the difference between the companies rather who employ this human-centered, customer-centric approach to designing their products and services. So it really does pay off. So design thinking has 5 critical steps to it. But really, I would say the most important, if the only thing you remember about design thinking coming out of this is that it is grounded in that human centricity, that customer centric, and it starts and ends with empathy. It permeates everything that you do in a design thinking context. And then of course there's testing. Here it's drawn out as a very linear process, and you'll see that pretty much everywhere. But in reality, especially once you get really comfortable with design thinking as both a philosophy and a methodology, you really realize how fluid and flexible everything is. But again, it's always grounded in that concept of empathy. So that brings us to design sprints. So although design thinking is a very powerful framework, it's sometimes very hard, especially at the beginning of a design thinking journey for an enterprise or a startup or scale-up organization. It's hard to wrap your arms around how to bring it into your day-to-day, into your team functioning and so on. And what I really love about design sprints is it provides a really structured, systematic process that uses the principles and the stages of design thinking, but in a very applicable, very repeatable, and very understandable method. So you often hear it referred to as a recipe, and I would actually really agree with that, simply because it's a prescriptive structure of cumulative activities. Also, like a recipe, once you're familiar with it and the ingredients, which in this case would be the activities, you can start to modify it slightly or riff on it depending on the needs and the particular scenario of a given team or organization. And certainly we've had to do that a couple of times with some of our clients. So it's not actually that old. The formative book here, Sprint, by Jig Knapp, John Zaratsky, and Brendan Kowitz from Google Ventures. This was just released in 2016, and there's some familiar elements to it. It brings in some elements of agile and lean startup and design thinking. But the process itself through this book wasn't released until 2016. And how it came to be is this trifecta of awesome designers. We're working through Google Ventures with startups such as Facebook and Slack and so on. And over the course of 200 plus iterations, they really refined this process to the really seamless structure that it is now. AGN Smart is a design agency out of Germany, and in early 2017, their CEO came across the book, read it on a flight, cover to cover. In that moment, decided, oh my God, this is life-altering, and changed the entire client delivery of his agency to focus exclusively on design sprints in an enterprise environment. So over the course of 100+ iterations in an enterprise environment, they then refined the process to what's known as Design Sprint 2.0, and you can easily find all sorts of awesome content from them online. Very similar to the 5-day sprint, just a slightly truncated version. The activities are slightly modified in the first couple days, and the whole purpose is that it's a little bit more amenable for the enterprise environment. So big tip of the hat to them. So we were very lucky to work with John Zaratsky, one of the Sprint book authors, in June and November of last year, and hopefully in the coming months and into next year. And in his own words, design sprints are best served when your scenario, your project, your problem is very uncertain, very unknown. There's some element of risk to it. When it's a high stakes project and it's sort of overwhelming and you're not sure where to start, design sprints are probably a great option for you. So why would you use a design sprint? And sometimes I find these points are really helpful in selling your business case, your design sprint business case in your local environment if there's some hesitation or concern around it. And the first is that it offers purposeful, focused activities. And when we're dealing with problems that are difficult or unclear or uncertain, or there's a high degree of risk or overwhelm, it's hard to know where to start sometimes. It's as simple as that. Hard to know where to start, what to do, what to focus on. And sprints provide a really formidable structure to just get the team going. And then the process itself yields all sorts of learnings and so on. So purposeful focused activities is a really helpful endeavor. Alignment and clarity, especially if you're working in a large, complex enterprise environment, alignment is elusive at best, and it's hard to maintain. And it's hard to underscore the importance of alignment, especially when you don't know what not having it results in. So, in enterprise environments, we have these large departments and departmental silos, and there's all sorts of different information barriers. We also have a lot of competing priorities. So when it comes to solving these really important, complex problems, it's really hard to get everybody on the same page. The beautiful characteristic of a design sprint is it brings a very cross-functional team together. And whereas sometimes those competing priorities or different perspectives are disruptive, in this context, it's really an asset because it gives the team a bigger picture on the problem, and together they can very quickly align around some ideas and solutions to try. So extremely valuable. Oops. What's happening here? My mouse is stuck, sorry. Okay, well, we'll just carry on. The next one is traction, gaining traction and fostering action. So as I said earlier, it's sometimes very difficult to know where to get started. But the other piece is you often get stuck in these consistent and constant discussion cycles. So, you've got the problem, that, you have 5 meetings about it, a couple brainstorms, and the conversation keeps going and going and going, and you're still not able to move the problem solving forward. So sprints put everybody in a room to focus on one single problem, and you can move forward with that quite easily. Sorry, I don't know why my mouse is stuck here. The next selling point to a design sprint and bringing it internally, and this one's really important, is it compresses your discovery time in an unbelievable amount. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So sometimes you can compress months or weeks or more of work into one 5-day period. What you'll find is a design sprint can often easily rival 6 or more weeks of traditional discovery. So that's a huge selling point on its own. And lastly, and we've touched on the point of design sprints is, of course, to learn. Hopefully you're using it in the context of de-risking some of your riskiest assumptions, usually in the realm of desirability, and Carlos will touch on that in a second. But you know, that testing early and getting valuable information up front means that you're de-risking your high stakes project immeasurably earlier on, and you end up with some very important strategic clarity and some good knowledge about your next steps.
Okay, thanks, Leah. Thanks for the introduction and for the overview of design sprints. So thanks again, everyone. I'm really delighted to share my experience and also go through design sprints with you. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I'm sure you can. But a lot of times, as Leah mentioned, you have this idea, perhaps you're a startup, perhaps you're running maybe a big, let's say, bet or enterprise project within a large organization, for example. And you want to launch that product, or you want to launch that idea or service, and you want to be successful. And you hope that your end users or your customers will, you know, enjoy the idea, you'll be able to get some traction, perhaps some funding. And so a lot of times there's a lot of this uncertainty and unknowns. And typically once you actually get your product in market, once you have your idea, let's say you've gone through the process, you've launched it, now you get access to data that actually tells you whether or not you were right on the right track, whether your customers love it or they hate it. The challenge is when you're going through this, let's say, traditional product development lifecycle, typically what happens is you have an idea and then you go through a bit of a build process and then you go through a launch process and then you get access to the data that you're looking for. Now, in that build process, a lot can happen. So if you're in a very large organization, for example, I think the average project lifecycle within a big company is anywhere between 12 to 18 months. And so a lot of things can happen. The scope can change, new requirements come in. And what tends to happen is that this build cycle gets delayed and it gets delayed and it gets delayed. And the longer that you're in this build cycle, the longer you, or the more that you increase the likelihood that it's actually going to fail. And so the risk starts to increase exponentially and you haven't necessarily delivered any value yet to the market. And so really you're starting to kind of increase this uncertainty and increase this risk. And so really what we're looking to do is we really want to shortcut that scenario. So we want to get to the data as quickly as possible and reduce that risk as quickly as possible while increasing the value. And this is really what the beauty about design sprints and what they allow us to do essentially, as Christina mentioned, when within a week we can kind of test our idea and get that market feedback, get that data quite quickly to know if we're on the right track or not. Now, what does a sprint look like? So when you're putting together your 1 week sprint, you're going to want to make sure that you have a cross-functional team and you want to have a lot of diversity on the team. So you want to have people with different perspectives, some subject matter experts that understand the context or the challenge or perhaps the product or idea that you're implementing, somebody that understands the market or the users very well. But then after that, all the people that can provide a different lens in terms of how you would actually implement that idea. So whether, perhaps if you're doing software, for example, you might have a developer, you might have a designer. So you really want to put together a mix of individuals coming from different backgrounds, different perspectives to really give you kind of a holistic and a great approach to your solution. In terms of some of the roles that are important for your sprint, so there's just 3 roles. One is a decider. So this is going to be somebody who is really vested in the outcome of the project or really vested in the outcome of the sprint. And this person will actually help the team to make decisions quite quickly. Ultimately, what we're doing is actually putting something in front of customers or users, for example. So we're actually going to maximize that amount of learning at the end. But before we get there, we have to make a lot of decisions around perhaps a problem area or a focus area, some different ideas, some solutions that we'd like to test, for example. So given that there's a lot of different decisions, we need a decider. And then the other aspect is really a facilitator, somebody who's going to guide the team using kind of like an objective or neutral stance that allows them to really kind of maximize their ability to problem solve and to come up with some great ideas. So this is somebody who's read the book, perhaps taken a course, for example, done some training, or is really passionate about walking the team through these activities. And then of course you have your experts or your people, within the team that are actually going to contribute to the sprint. Now, so you've got your cross-functional team, or let's say your multidisciplinary, or different experts, for example, and then you've got your key roles. The other thing you have to consider before diving into the activities are some key principles. So design sprints use a lot of what we call individual creativity or individual contribution. And so the concept here, it's a thing called together alone. So for many of you that have probably perhaps been in a meeting, and that meeting might get dominated by one or two people, and those individuals might be passionate about an idea or a topic, for example. And so naturally what tends to happen within meetings is that we have what's called groupthink. Now, if you're not careful, groupthink will kind of lead you down a path where you're only really testing, let's say, one idea. But within a sprint, we actually want to explore a lot of different ideas, many different ideas. And so in order for us to do that effectively, we need to hear from everybody individually and with equal voice, equal opportunity. And so what we call this is together alone, where we actually have a lot of individual activities. People contribute their ideas and what they're thinking individually. And then afterwards we go through an ability to kind of review those together as a group. The second thing is this principle of tangible over discussion. So the whole point is that we can keep going around and around in circles. Perhaps many of you have been in meetings where the meeting lasts forever, or maybe you have multiple meetings to discuss a meeting, for example. And so really quickly you'll notice that you're in these kind of unproductive conversations. But within a sprint, we want to move to something quite tangible. So we'll make use of a lot of visualization, for example. We'll make use of building, like whether it's a small prototype or acting out a scenario, for example. So the whole idea is that the sooner we can actually get to something tangible, the sooner we can learn if we're actually on the right track or not. And that kind of leads into the third principle, which is getting started or having an a bias for action is actually more important than being right. So instead of kind of, sticking to your ground and let's say arguing over a particular point, for example, the sooner we can actually build something and get some feedback on it, the sooner we'll know if we're actually on the right track or not. So mobilizing the team, spurring that action is really important. And then finally, the nice thing about sprints is that you don't have to have a Steve Jobs on your team. You don't have to have, the smartest person in the room, for example, or the most creative genius. Really what sprints do is that they pull out the creativity from everyone and give everybody an opportunity to shine, which gives us an opportunity to really select what we like from each of the different ideas that come to the table. So what does a sprint look like? So a couple things. One, sprints are typically 5 days, and the first day we're spent just exploring the problem and really understanding the business challenge. So perhaps you're not getting enough sales, for example, you're not acquiring enough users, you might be writing a SaaS application, you're not quite sure what's going on, you've plateaued, for example, and that perhaps might make a really great sprint challenge. So to really understand, okay, what's going on, how come we're not getting any new users, for example, how do we kind of inject some more growth into our application, into our product? And so the first day is really looking at, okay, so what are the different opportunities and what exactly is the problem that we should be focusing on? And so in the beginning, you just want to make sure that everyone's clear on exactly what the sprint challenge is. So, are we building a prototype, for example? Is it looking to improve the growth on a particular product, like increase revenue, or is it trying to protect our revenue? Or perhaps maybe it's a cost efficiency play, like make our revenue more efficient, for example. So it's just making sure that the team is clear exactly on what's the purpose of the sprint, what's the challenge, and how do we measure success? So coming out of the sprint, what are we expecting to have, just so everybody's aligned on that. And a lot of times you can just do a simple kind of one-page canvas before going into your sprint that just makes sure that, here's the overall challenge, here's how we're measuring success. Now on this day, so this is day one, we're exploring the challenge, for example. The other thing that we want to do is kind of look ahead a little bit, so provide a bit of a vision. And so now we start doing a couple of activities as team members where we say, okay, together alone, let's all kind of, write down on some Post-it notes, whether it's virtually, let's say through Zoom and an online collaboration whiteboard, or if you're in the office, for example, and you've got some Post-it notes. But the idea is, okay, so if we're optimistic and we're highly successful in 2 years from now, what does the world look like? And so this is an opportunity for everybody, again, to align on a long-term goal, on a key vision for the overall project. And then also the other thing we're looking at is, okay, what can go wrong? So what are some of the risks that we can run into? So we'd have a separate activity to jot down some of the risks. And then we formulate these risks into what's called sprint questions. So for example, if we're thinking, okay, you know, no one's going to like this idea, or customers won't like it, for example, you know, we might turn that into a question like, will customers like our idea? And so the whole point of sprint questions is that we then vote and rank these questions to understand what are the top 3 questions that we want to answer within this sprint. And so these are the questions that will help the team to then focus for the rest of the 5 days to understand what questions they need to answer by the end of the sprint. The other thing that we do is we then, on this first day, again, because we're still trying to explore the problem, explore our understanding of the overall challenge, we actually invite people to come in and talk to us. So perhaps if you're working on a very technical solution, you might actually want to maybe bring in some experts around that technical idea. So if it's cloud infrastructure, or if it's artificial intelligence or machine learning, and let's say you don't have an expert in your room, then you might actually pull somebody with that expertise and interview them during this first day. The other thing you might do is actually interview some users or some customers or somebody who's done some customer research already. So if there is somebody that has talked to your customers or has some of that data, you might actually bring them in again on that first day to really have that conversation, ask them a few questions. So usually we interview anywhere between 3 to 5 people to really provide more context overall into the challenge and what we're working on. And now this is obviously beyond the context of the team that we have within the room. And then the final output for that first day is really to, sorry, I'm gonna get Leah to click the, seem to have lost control on the actual presentation. The final artifact for that day is to build a map. Now, the idea with the map is just a visualization. So not to overcomplicate it, you know, usually it's 10 to 15 kind of key steps around how your user is going to interact with your idea or your product, let's say, and their final goal. So, you know, you would actually just think about visualizing, you know, who's our customer, who's our user, what are the steps that they're taking as they're interacting with our product, you know, what's the goal that they're trying to achieve, either if it's a product or a service, or let's say an idea, for example. Visualize those steps, and then all of the data that you've collected throughout the day in terms of, okay, so what are some of the challenges, or what are some of the opportunities, for example, we start to overlay that on top of the map to really then pick a key area that we want to focus on for the rest of the sprint. So if you can imagine, if you're running a SaaS application, for example, and let's say it's an application that helps entrepreneurs capture receipts for their small business so that they can actually do it electronically, not have to worry about paperwork. And so you might map that journey of how they interact with the existing application today, and then kind of highlight a key area to say, okay, this is a problem area that we really want to improve. If we can improve that area, then we'll get a lot more traction in our product and in our idea. So once you've selected where you want to focus on by kind of visualizing the overall problem and then choosing a target, that's going to set you up for the next day, which is going to be all about looking at coming up with many different solutions. So day 1 is done, you've explored the problem, you have a target area, you know what you want to focus on as a team. Day 2 now, you want to just really kind of blue sky it. So this is where we use a lot of divergent thinking. We usually start off day 2 by saying, okay, everybody do some research, go and find some similar ideas to similar problems, perhaps in different industries and different applications. And really it's just to kind of unlock some lateral thinking, just to kind of, you know, get everybody to warm up and start thinking about other opportunities, other possibilities on how to actually solve for this particular challenge or for this problem. You know, you might like how another vendor or another application perhaps solves this particular challenge. You might look at something totally different, but just really enjoy maybe an implementation or a design pattern or a detail out of it. And so during that time, individuals have an opportunity to research and then present back to their group. So they can actually share back what they liked and what they feel could be relevant for their particular context and their particular scenario. And then finally, after that is done, then we actually go into what's called 4-part sketching. So the idea here is to really get our ideas on paper, and you can still do a lot of this virtually as well. A lot of times we'll use Zoom, and you can actually just get people to, you know, put their ideas down on blank paper if they've got a pen and paper wherever they're located. You know, take a photo with their, let's say, camera, and then just upload it into let's say a shared drive, for example, or an application that you're using to collaborate. And so it can be very effective. The whole point of sketching, or to just kind of write and draw out some of your ideas, is again, just to, the brain kind of processes information 60,000 times faster when it's visual. There's a lot more data that you get when things are visual than just by using words. So it can be a very powerful concept to sketch out some ideas. And again, this is an individual activity. And what we typically do is give people an opportunity first just to take down some notes. So go over kind of all of the things that we discussed yesterday, perhaps as part of that, overall challenge or the problem. Things like write down the goal, write down our sprint questions, write down what some of the subject matter experts said, for example, or our users said. And then afterwards, get them to just start on their own, coming up with a few ideas. Then we do another quick warm-up activity, which, in 8 minutes, they have to come up with 8 different ideas or 8 different, let's say, iterations of an idea that they have, just as a fun warm-up activity. And then finally, for the end of the day, you give them a really good bulk of time, at least 45 minutes to an hour, for them to come up kind of with their 3-part sketch, which has got like a beginning, a middle, and an end on how they would actually tell the story of their idea. Now, the whole point is that they're doing this anonymously. So even when they're coming up with their final 3-part sketch at the end of the day, they don't write down their name or anything. Ideas should hang on their own so that we can all kind of evaluate them evenly without having to worry about groupthink or any kind of bias. And so really, it's that 3-step sketch at the end of the day that eventually gets put in front of people the next day so that we can actually go through it and vote on it. So everything up until that point was just some warm-up activities. So the third day is all about making decisions. And so this is now where people get an opportunity to go through all the different sketches on their own. They can kind of earmark, things that they liked about each of the different ideas, by just placing some dots or some voting. And again, you can use online collaboration tools to make this happen. Or if you're in person, then you can use just, red dots and some whiteboard space, for example. But everybody gets some individual quiet time. It's like an art museum where they kind of walk through each of the different ideas and highlight some things that they like about them. And then as a facilitator, you simply just walk through and repeat back to the group in terms of where some of that interest lies and what people are liking about those ideas. And then eventually people do a straw poll. So they actually indicate, okay, which of these ideas do we like the most in terms of maybe there's a base here that we'd like to use to build a prototype. And so everyone will actually have one kind of vote ultimately on which base they would like to use. And then ultimately the decider will make the final decision. So as a decider, now you can actually see, okay, this is where all the interest lies. Here's where individuals would like to progress or move forward with. And then based on this information, here's kind of my final decision in terms of what idea I would like to move forward with and implement. So the decider actually gets the final call. The last activity, once you've decided on what is the main idea that you would like to move forward with, then afterwards it's just kind of visualizing, okay, what are the steps that we're going to use to test this idea with real people on the final day? So just to be clear on, kind of overall the general theme in terms of that journey, what does that look like? How are we going to actually test this idea with people? And so that's called a user test flow. And everybody has another opportunity to kind of envision what that would look like. And then we can actually go through and choose the steps that we think are most relevant and are most appropriate, and kind of move forward with that main flow. Now, the fourth day is all about, again, storyboarding, visualizing. So now that we've got our idea and we've got our general flow, now we'll actually sketch out that idea in more detail. So if it's a product, perhaps you might do some screens. Like if you're building a mobile app, for example, you might actually kind of sketch out some of the different screens that would exist in the app. If you're doing a service, you might sketch out the different steps within the service, the interaction points, kind of the overall storyline, like who's saying what, for example. If it's an AI voice, chat, let's say, or tool, you might actually do something similar. So just, again, just kind of something that allows that if somebody else was to come in now and actually build your prototype, they can kind of take the storyboard and understand what's going on. Now, the reality is the team is actually going to be building the prototype. So it isn't going to be a separate group or a separate team. But if you did have that, they'd be able to, this is kind of like your plan. So they can take this and move it forward. Now, the fourth day is all about kind of building the prototype. So it's actually looking at how do we build something that's going to be high enough fidelity that will actually elicit the reactions that we want from our users. So low fidelity prototypes like sketches, for example, can be quite powerful, and there's still great if you want to get some quick feedback. But sometimes building something with a little bit more high fidelity will allow you to really elicit that reaction that you're looking for from your users. So in the example here that we got here from AJ and Smart, they were working on a new chocolate bar, for example, and so they just used a color printer to quickly, print off some wrappers that they could then tape to a fake chocolate bar, put it on a table amongst other potential chocolate bars, and then see how their users would react. And really, they were just testing the value proposition. They were just testing, would people gravitate to this particular chocolate bar, for example, based on what it said on the wrapper. So they just wanted to test if there was actually a value proposition there that users and customers would like. So in their example, doing some graphics and then printing that out on a printer and then taping it up would do the work. If you're building a mobile app, there's lots of really great tools these days that aren't even that expensive, for example, that allow you to simulate a mobile app without necessarily having to spend months building it out, for example. So something that you could actually do. There's a lot of tools now that will actually take your sketches and convert them into high fidelity mockups and also prototypes, and do that all within a couple of hours. So the tools have really advanced over the last few years that allow us to prototype rapidly, quite quickly, even with high fidelity. So this is something that the team can kind of creatively say, okay, who's going to be working on which piece? Like, who's going to focus maybe on perhaps building the prototype? Someone else will focus on perhaps getting the user testing and the scripts ready, for example. So what questions are we going to ask? So this is all, day 4 is all about making sure that people are aligned on who's doing what and actually building out the prototype. And then finally, day 5 now is where you get the opportunity to put that in front of real people, put that in front of your users and get kind of those reactions. So you could do this in person. Now, most likely these days you're doing this remotely. So using Zoom, for example, is a tool that you can use to invite your users, get them to interact, and also be able to record, and the team has an opportunity to observe and collect that feedback. There's a great article by Jacob Nielsen around the power of 5 and how most of the time you only really need 5 users and to bring them in, to see them interacting with your prototype, to be able to get 80% of the patterns or the data that you're looking for to help you make a better decision. So this is qualitative research. You really don't need a lot of people. Quite quickly, you'll start seeing those patterns. So if they fumble or if they have an issue, you'll see that quite vividly and quite quickly. So the nice thing is you don't really need a lot of users to be able to test with it. And then really after the user testing is done, the team is just kind of going through all the data and looking at, what are all the different patterns that exist here, and then how do these answer the questions that we had for our sprint questions, so for our goal. Should we pivot, should we persevere, or should we pull the plug on this idea based on this feedback? So really now you're making a recommendation to the business, or to, if you're a startup, you're making a recommendation maybe to your investors, or as an entrepreneur, you have to make a decision based on this data, what would I like to do? So pivot, persevere, or pull the plug. You might run an iteration sprint. So maybe you learned some really critical feedback that said, okay, this isn't good, but if you make an adjustment that you could actually perhaps improve that idea. And so you might actually do maybe a smaller sprint just with now that ideation portion around, okay, we know kind of based on the feedback that we received, what we have to make some adjustments on. So you might have a compressed sprint that really is now just an iteration. And this can be quite powerful, especially stacking them back to back to now really have a more appropriate solution that you're going to market with. So overall, in summary, design sprints can be really helpful, especially if you've got a complex challenge ahead of you, or you're kicking off a new idea, let's say, and there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk. They're especially helpful to test the desirability of how your users or customers will interact with it, so that you're not working on a problem that nobody wants, for example, so that it is a significant problem and there's some desirability around that particular solution. They'll actually get you some data faster. So I think to Leah's point around getting that traction, you're not waiting weeks or months, for example. You've made a commitment, you've time boxed it, you said, okay, I want to learn something this week, and you make that learning and you get that data much earlier. They're great at aligning team members as well. So if you're, let's say, perhaps working on a big project, you're going to kick off a big project and maybe you're putting together a new team. getting everyone on the same page in terms of what's our long-term goal, what is our risks, generally what does the solution look like, and kind of getting that out of the way quite quickly within 5 days is really powerful, especially if you're looking at building a high performance team that will then perhaps be taking this project and working on it, let's say to build out an MVP or a first release that might take a few months. So this can be a really great tool to kind of bring everybody together and get them on the same page quite quickly. And then ultimately, if you got a high risk project or it's high stakes, you want to do everything you can to kind of look into the future so that you're not going to be running into any surprises. And so this framework and this tool is much more prescriptive, let's say. I think Leah mentioned it's kind of like a recipe. So a lot of times with design thinking, with agile methods, with lean startup, is that their philosophy, they've got lots of principles, but they don't tell you exactly what you need to do, for example. This is a framework within design thinking that literally tells you, okay, this is how you do it. So even if you don't take that 4-year bachelor at Stanford, if you only have 1 week, do these activities. It obviously helps if you've got somebody with experience that has done it before that can help guide the group, for example. But if you do these activities, at the end, you're going to get some really valuable insights and valuable learning that will then help you to be more successful moving forward. So I'm going to stop there because I know we're going to be moving into our Q&A, and I can see Christina is going to.
Yes, I'm back. What an incredible session so far. I love how you've laid out your content, and you've talked about how quickly design sprints can change the way that teams accelerate and innovate and get to problem solving very quickly. A couple of questions then that we received in advance of this masterclass for both you and Leah. I'm going to start with the first one. It's this idea of like, I've bought into this. Imagine there's a member of the audience that are like, yeah, I've either participated in this, or I know about this, or I love this. Now, how do I sell the idea of a design sprint in my organization? And or how do I get the sprint team and their managers to commit to the full duration of the sprint? So 2 questions related to commitment. How do I get people to say, yes, we've got to do this? And then how do I make sure that that people are committed for the full duration? Because at the end of the day, there are still probably achievables and KPIs that people need to have happen in their day-to-day work. How do you make the space for this kind of incredible iteration?
Yeah, excuse me. Those are 2 very valuable questions, and questions we get all the time. I would say there are 2 main resistance points. The first being that, this is still a relatively new concept, a new process. Design thinking, though it's sort of mainstream, again, it's sort of hard to wrap your arms around. And so, those 2 things combined, for organizations who haven't run this type of thing, it's a little bit daunting, because until you've experienced it, until you see how much the team accomplishes and the powerful learnings that come out of it, it's hard to understand what the end result or outcome will be. So that's resistant point number 1. And then the other point, as you rightly mentioned, is this time commitment. And especially, whether actually it doesn't matter what type of organization, we've all got a crazy number of priorities all the time, and things are shifting, and life is pretty crazy for, pretty much anybody who works in a knowledge job. And so, dedicating that time, that 5 days, 4 days, or in a virtual context, it's a little bit different, is really challenging. So what we go back to all the time are some of the things we mentioned throughout. The first is that compression of discovery time and the twice value for cost. That's something that, especially once you've been through it, it's truly astronomical to see how much the team gets done that would normally take 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks. So that's suggestion number 1. And then it's some of those other elements, like the strategic learning of what your next steps are, or getting you that much closer to MVP or go-to-market product or service, that can't be denied as well. And I guess sort of wrapped around that is this concept of risk mitigation early up front. So in the traditional waterfall approach, when Carlos was showing the traditional product life cycle, it could be 18 months until you learn whether your product is a go or not, if your customers want it or not. But here you're getting information that tells you if you want to persevere, pivot, or kill it within potentially 5 days. So those are probably the 3 points that we always suggest. And then I guess the third one is getting everybody on the same page. That seems like something sort of fluffy sometimes, but when you've experienced misalignment and then you see the power of bringing a team together for focused, dedicated problem solving, it's pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. So I'm thinking too, if there's somebody particularly on the call that thinks that they want to share the methodology, this even taking the video forward is probably a good first step, and connecting back with Leah and Carlos. Another question though that came through the Q&A is, imagine strategic planning as the product. Do you think, in your professional opinion, that strategic planning could be done through design sprint?
That's a really great question. We've actually run sprints before for strategy. So instead of, let's say, testing out a product at the end, really what you're doing now is getting feedback on your strategy. Now, because it's highly facilitated, a lot of the things that we want in terms of understanding that long-term goal, that vision, the overall, the risk that could be associated with it. So you'd have to make some adjustment, let's say, to the activities, but because it's a great alignment tool, it's a great tool to really test some ideas or really come up with that vision. It can be very powerful for that. So if you're interested in that, we'd be happy to share some separate adjustments that you'd make in terms of activities to the design sprint that really allow you to focus more on like an overall strategy.
Yeah, and sorry, if I can just add to that, design sprints are so early in their life. And more we see different organizations and agencies and companies sort of riffing off them and employing the principles and the practices and tools and the activities and so on in different ways. And you can even boil it down to a 60-minute design sprint. We call it rapid decision-making sprints. And they're great for replacing traditional brainstorms or, leadership meetings or team meetings, or, when you really want to rapidly come up with an action plan, but there's still a lot of opacity or uncertainty around it. So there's all sorts of ways, once you get familiar with the principles and the concepts, to modify them for whatever you need.
Okay, thank you. Another question then, when you were talking a little bit about pivot, persevere, or pull the plug, what happens if your design sprint shows that your idea or solution doesn't work? What's the recommendations that you would offer when that's the end result?
Great question. So if the nice thing about a design sprint is that you haven't necessarily spent a lot of money, right? So you've taken a week, let's say, of people's time, which is very valuable. But the nice thing about that is that you can make the recommendation to say, okay, based on the data that we have right now, this doesn't seem to be a good solution, or it's also not the best opportunity. So there's perhaps something that we've actually highlighted that is more significant. And so when we're making that recommendation back to our investors or our governance team, it becomes a lot easier based on data. Now, you still have this thing happen where people want you to, they're not satisfied necessarily with the data. So they want to redo the experiment or make it happen again. So the good thing about this is because they're compressed and they're short in their format, that even if you're actually doing 2 or 3 sprints, for example, that's still within a reasonable budget to be able to make that, okay, pull the plug assessment without necessarily having to spend, 12 months, for example.
And maybe to that end, when we talk about things like determining pivot, persevere, pull the plug, another great question that came in sort of related to that is what are some of the common challenges that are faced by the teams during a design sprint process? What do you know to be sort of true, even those teams who are early adopters and have been doing this for a while, or teams that are beginning to adopt methodology, can you give sort of the heads up of like, expect this to happen? So that when, you know, they're in the process, they might say, okay, well, yeah, we kind of expected this, good, bad, or ugly. Any recommendations there?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is design sprints are fundamentally a different way of working for most organizations. And so, you know, anytime you have close collaboration, there's sort of an ebb and flow of energy. And also, you know, there's still personalities and people think differently and so on. So the structure and the activities of the design sprint help mitigate that tremendously. You know, whether it's, you know, these independent brainstorming activities, or, you know, any number of things that sort of bypass these circuitous conversations and opportunities for things to go badly. But, you know, nevertheless, it is a very intense process. And so, you know, the energy of the group sort of ebbs and flows as you move through it. So that's something really important to know, not only as a facilitator, but as a participant ahead of time. And then the other thing I would say is, depending on what the challenge is, sometimes, well, always some work has to be done ahead of the sprint. And it really just depends on a number of variables, how much work has to be done ahead of time. And included in that pre-work is communicating with the team and setting expectations and, you know, introducing the process as much as you can, so that everybody's sort of going into it with their eyes somewhat open to what to expect. And the problem is perhaps a little bit more clear, and so on. So yeah, it's just the structure is helpful, but anything that you can do to sort of identify where some of the challenges might be is what we always find helpful. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I'm going to keep with the theme of preparation, because it was a perfect segue, Leah, but different. How do you prepare for the user test and the users you select?
So, good question. You want to do the user selection process as early as possible within the sprint. So after day one, once you've selected your overall target, your focus area, you have an understanding of the problem, the challenge, this becomes a lot easier now to decide, okay, who do we need to bring in on day 5? So by the end of day 1, you should be clear now on who your users are or the people that you want to bring in. And so now you can start the recruitment process. So if you're a SaaS application and perhaps you're business to business, it might be a little bit easier, you know, to message some of your current accounts or subscribers, for example, and let them know, okay, we would love to get your feedback to be able to actually, you know, build out a better solution. We'll compensate you for your time. Perhaps it's like a $50 Amazon card, for example. A lot of times people are more open to participate once they know that they're contributing to a solution, or, you know, they're going to be part of kind of the creative process. So just making sure that you've got the right channels to be able to reach out and access your users or your customers. And then the other part is now getting that script ready. So thinking through, okay, what are the questions that we want to ask our users? And a lot of that will come from those sprint questions. So, you know, what are the riskiest assumptions that we're making about our idea, about the problem? How do we convert those into questions? And then how do we actually ask these questions when we're, you know, putting this in front of our users at the end? So definitely a lot of preparation, but usually, you know, if you don't have, let's say, a separate team that's doing some of that recruitment for you and handling kind of the scheduling, then at least it's 1 or 2 people within your sprint team that are making sure that that's happening throughout the week.
And if I can add just one piece to that is usually the end of the prototyping day, what we tend to do and strongly urge others to do is to have at least a run through of the user test flow and the interview script, because what you'll find is usually you'll make some adjustments after that run through. So it's always a good practice to do that.
That's terrific. So I'm just doing a quick time check here. We're almost at 2 o'clock, but I feel like there's perhaps one more question that helps to bridge sort of early stage to end stage of the sprint. So if the design sprint focus is mostly on the testing for desirability and adoption, whether that's through user testing or through the early iteration, how do you then begin to focus or shift to the feasibility and the viability?
Great question. So a design sprint is one experiment, let's say. And I like to call it an experiment. And it's nice to be able to run at least one experiment per week. Now, the beauty about the design sprint is that the chances are it's your first experiment because you're really just trying to focus on, is this a real problem? Do customers really want this? That doesn't mean that you'll stop there. So if you do, let's say, make the next round of funding, right? Or your investors or your governance team or your management team says, hey, okay, this has got some legs. Users like this, customers like this. Now let's explore perhaps doing an MVP. And that MVP, you still want to have, not a lot of sprints. And these sprints might be more, let's say, agile sprints, where you start to kind of now look at the feasibility, for example. And you still might have a checkpoint, let's say, after 4 weeks, for example. But those other questions, because there's other risks that you have now around feasibility or viability, you might just use a slightly different kind of methodology to be able to test some of those aspects out.
Okay, and then there's a question that came in the Q&A and I gotta ask it before we close out. Does any of this change with smaller teams? So if you're a 1 or 2 person team or a 3 person team, I think in some ways that smaller teams are agile in that the focus and how they iterate, but would you make any recommendations for teams that are much smaller?
Definitely. You want to do it at least with 3 people.
Okay.
But then I would just be creative about the people that you might be able to invite. So perhaps you can actually co-create with your customers or your users, or there is someone who's got some subject matter expertise that you would be able to invite, even if you can't get them for the whole sprint and it's still just the 3 of you, for example. But really just thinking through like who could add a lot of diversity and perspective into this idea or into this problem. So I guess that's how I'd answer that.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you both Carlos and Leah for this presentation on design sprints and transforming and guiding development of ideas fast. It was, a really incredible experience. I love that you dialed in to the 5-day process. You talked about size of team. You talked about the iteration and the process of that and having really tangible outcomes as a result of a deep dive and a focused plan. So to that end, thank you so much for your time today and the expertise that you brought with you to this masterclass. And, as with today, we believe that innovation leaders really reframe challenges always. And so those of you on the call today, we invite you to join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. for our final fireside chat of our summer series with our board of directors on tackling transformation with Anna Fote, the Director of Global Digital Transformation Office at Sun Life Financial, and Michael Schmalz, the President of Digital Extremes. Using the link in the chat, you can register for tomorrow to see other expert advice like we've had today. And, that's sort of the end of my commercial break. I really do. Again, thank you both, Carlos and Leah, for joining us. And to everybody on the call with us today, have an incredible day. Be well and take good care. Bye for now.